God is always present around us, everywhere, at all times, and brings faith and hope. That is why images or objects are always loved by each of us. And today, the story I'm about to tell you is just a small aspect, but it gives you many things to think about life. Please listen. Caroline and the story behind the cross necklace. Caroline stood near a folding table at the community center in Lawrenceburg, Tennessee, where the air was filled with bustling laughter. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the warm aroma of pastries, creating a familiar space, where people still remember each other's names, where life seems to slow down so that true connections can be formed. In the midst of the bustling conversations, a little girl gently tugged on Caroline's sleeve. Her clear eyes stopped on the necklace with a sparkling cross around her neck. Then, in a soft but curious voice, she spoke. The question was so simple it was innocent, yet so powerful it made Caroline's eyes sting. On the table in front of her, flyers were neatly arranged. She smiled, shook hands, and answered each question with her usual sincerity. Events like these always brought her joy, not for the attention, but for the genuine conversations, the raw, unvarnished stories, the quiet, meaningful moments that reminded her why she had chosen this path. In the middle of a conversation with an elderly woman about the local school system, she felt a gentle tug on her sleeve. At first, she ignored it, but then the tug came again, small, persistent. She turned. There stood a little girl, petite, about 7 years old. Her chestnut curls framed her round, freckled face. Her tiny hands clutched the hem of her floral dress, and her big brown eyes were fixed on the sparkling necklace around Caroline's neck. Caroline slowly sat down, leveling her eyes with the girl. She smiled gently. "Hello," she said softly, her voice warm. "What's your name?" She hesitated before answering, her voice a whisper, as if afraid to break the silence between them. "Samantha." "It's nice to meet you, Samantha." But her eyes didn't leave. Instead, she raised a small, slightly trembling finger and pointed to the slender gold cross resting on Caroline's collarbone. "What does your necklace mean?" The room around them didn't exactly fall silent, but to Caroline, the atmosphere had suddenly changed. The question, so simple, so innocent, had a weight she didn't expect. For years, the cross had lain still against her skin, close to the beat of her heart. It had never been just a piece of jewelry. It was a token, a reminder of something bigger than herself. And now, for the first time in years, someone was asking her about it. Caroline opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. Instead, her mind slipped silently back to the past, to a night she'd tried so hard to bury. But some memories, no matter how much she wanted to forget, would never fade. Caroline blinked, still kneeling before the girl, but her mind had drifted to another place, a distant time, where a moment had shaped her in ways she hadn't expected. She was 19, a freshman at Belmont University in Nashville, eager for the future, but struggling more than she let on. Between a demanding schedule, 2 part-time jobs, and the nagging worry that she wasn't good enough, not worthy enough, she was bracing herself. Her parents had taught her to live by faith since she was a child, but at the time she began to wonder if she really believed. But at the time, faith seemed distant. She did everything she did, going to church every Sunday, whispering her prayers before bed, but it felt hollow, as if she were talking to an empty room. Then the call came. It was past midnight. The pale blue light from her laptop screen was reflected on the wall of her dorm room, where she was cramming for exams. The phone vibrated on the table. She almost ignored it, but something, a vague feeling, told her to pick it up. And the moment she heard her mother's voice, she knew. Her grandmother, the one who had taught her how to make cookies from scratch, was gone. Her grandmother, the one who always carried the gentle scent of lavender, who spoke of faith as if it were as solid as the ground beneath their feet, was gone. A sudden heart attack. No warning, no goodbye. Caroline barely remembers the next few hours. Only fragments. Her roommate's soft sobs somewhere in the background, the numbness in her chest, and the suffocating realization that she would never hear her grandmother's voice again. For the first time in her life, she felt truly alone. The next morning, she did everything mechanically, packed a few clothes, booked a bus ticket home, but it was as if she were just a spectator, watching someone else live her life. Her hands moved, she packed her things, She boarded the bus, but it all felt foreign, disjointed, as if she weren't really there. When she arrived at her childhood home, everything was instantly wrong. Her grandmother's chair was still there, empty, silent. The air around her was heavy, not just with loss, but with words left unsaid, moments that would never come again. That night, even under the old covers, she couldn't sleep. Finally, she quietly entered her grandmother's room. The scent of lavender still hung in the air, lingering on the sheets like a part of her grandmother. And then, right on the nightstand, something caught her eye. A slender gold necklace, a small cross resting on the worn pages of a Bible. Her grandmother had worn that necklace every day of her life. Karoline picked it up, her fingertips brushing the cool metal. But at that moment, she stopped. There was something about its weight, about the way it felt in her hand. More than just a piece of jewelry. It meant something deeper, something she wasn't ready to grasp. But sometimes faith finds you before you're ready to accept it. In the dim light of her grandmother's room, Karoline clutched the cross so tightly in her hand that the tiny edges dug into her flesh. She thought she'd feel comfort, but instead of comfort, Karoline felt anger. How could God take her, someone like her, so loving, so strong in faith, and yet she was still here, lost in unanswered questions? She'd heard people talk about finding peace in loss, about believing that everything happened for a reason. But that night, all those words rang hollow. Nothing could make sense. Still, she slid the necklace over her head, letting the cross rest on her chest. At first it was cold, unfamiliar. Then suddenly it was too heavy. As if all her pain, her disbelief, her anger were pouring into it. The tears came, hard and uncontrollable, shaking her whole body. She collapsed on the edge of the bed, not in a quiet, restrained way, but in a deep, tearing pain that ripped away every layer of her, leaving her naked, vulnerable, defenseless. She curled up, burying her face in her grandmother's blanket, the last thing that carried the warmth of the dead. The scent of lavender lingered, as if she were still here. She didn't know how long she lay there, only that, at some point in the pain, she whispered, maybe to herself, maybe to God, if he existed. If you're real, if you're really out there, I need to know. I need to feel something. Anything. Because right now I can't feel anything. The silence that followed almost overwhelmed her. No voice from heaven. No sudden warm light. No answer from somewhere beyond her sight. Just the soft chirping of crickets outside the window. The old sound of the house stretching out in the cold of the night. She should have felt stupid. Should have gotten up, dried her face, told herself she needed to keep going. But she didn't. Instead, she lay still, waiting. And then, it happened. Not a voice, not a supernatural image like in fairy tales. Not a big deal. Just a tiny change. A shift. A change so small it was almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Her heartbeat, so broken and chaotic just minutes ago, began to slow. The tightness in her chest didn't disappear entirely, but it eased just a little. Her breathing, so ragged and shaky, steadied, and somewhere, deep inside, where only she could feel it, a gentle warmth crept into the coldest corners. It wasn't an answer. It wasn't a solution, but it was something. For the first time since the night she'd picked up that phone call, she didn't feel like she was sinking. She gently squeezed the crucifix between her fingers. Karoline stared at the crucifix through her tears. It had belonged to her, but in that moment, she felt like it had found her. She didn't know what was coming next. She didn't know if her faith would ever be the way it had been when she was a child, simple and unquestioning. But one thing was certain, she was no longer alone, and that was enough to keep her going. But faith wasn't a single moment. It was a journey, and sometimes the hardest part was just moving on. The days after her grandmother's death passed like water, slowly, heavily. Everything was heavy, slow, hesitant. Karoline kept going, nodding, smiling weakly when loved ones patted her shoulder, repeating words of condolence that seemed to blend together into a faint sound. But something was different. She still had questions. The pain in her chest was still there when she thought about the irrevocable loss. But every time she touched the small cross resting on her collarbone, she felt a little steadier. A week later, she was back in Belmont. When she got off the bus, her heart was still broken. But at least it wasn't broken anymore. She'd expected the loneliness to come crashing down on her again, to engulf her. But it didn't. Instead, there was something else, a quiet stability. One night, about a month later, Karoline sat in the student lounge, flipping through her textbooks without really reading anything. Brandon, a classmate she knew only vaguely from lectures, sat down across from her. His eyes were red and empty. "Are you okay?" she asked. At first he didn't answer. Then after a shaky breath, he whispered, "My dad died last night." Karoline paused. She should have said something, but the words never came. "I'm sorry," or "That must have been hard." Those words flashed through her mind, but they were so fragile, as if just touching his pain would shatter and disappear. Instead of saying something trite, Karoline quietly reached up to touch the cross around her neck, her fingers tracing the familiar lines, a habit she had done hundreds of times since that night in her grandmother's room. She took a breath, then admitted softly, "My grandmother died last month." Brandon looked up, his eyes still clouded with loss. "I don't know what to say in times like this," she continued, her voice soft but sincere. "But I know how it feels, like nothing makes sense anymore." Brandon swallowed, his jaw tightening as he blinked faster, holding something back. "Yeah," he said softly. Karoline hesitated. Karoline quietly unclasped the necklace around her neck and held it out to him. Brandon frowned, shaking his head. I can't accept this." "You're not accepting it," she said, her voice soft. "It's just a loan, until you feel like you can breathe again." He didn't answer right away, just looking at her, as if she had just given him something much bigger than a piece of jewelry. Then with trembling hands, he carefully took it. Little did Karoline know at the time that that small moment, that simple act, would be just the beginning. Because sometimes faith isn't about having all the answers. Sometimes it's about being there when someone needs it. Sometimes someone is so lost that they can't find their way back. But faith always has a way of coming back, when you least expect it. Karoline blinked, pulling herself back to the present, back to the little girl standing before her, eyes wide, waiting silently. She could still feel the weight of that moment, the moment she had given away what had been her support, hoping it might keep someone else from sinking. Her gaze slid down to the slender crucifix resting on her collarbone, the one she had bought to replace the old one, the one she had given away without regret. But the first necklace, the one that had belonged to her grandmother, had never returned to her. Brandon had kept it. A year after she had given it to him, he admitted he was still not ready to return it. Karoline just smiled and said, "Then it's yours." And now, years later, here she was, face to face with a little girl who had no idea how much such a small item would change her life. Karoline took a deep breath, keeping her voice steady. "My grandmother gave me a necklace like this," she said, her fingers gently tracing the cross. "At first I thought it was just a piece of jewelry, something pretty to wear. But after she died, I realized it was so much more than that. It reminded me that, even when I felt alone, I was never truly alone." The girl's eyes flickered, a look that Karoline recognized immediately, a quiet understanding, deeper than her years. "My mother had one," she whispered. Her tiny fingers reached up to touch her neck. "Just bare skin, nothing there. She had to sell it," she said softly. "We needed the money to buy food more than to keep a piece of jewelry." Karoline's chest tightened. Karoline didn't have to ask. She heard the answer in the way her voice shook, in the silence that stretched between words, so she didn't hesitate. With gentle hands, she reached behind her neck, unclasping the necklace. The little girl's eyes widened as Karoline took her small hand in hers, placing the cross in it. "It's yours now," she said, her voice low. The little girl stared at the chain, her lips trembling. "But I can't, I can," Karoline interrupted, smiling softly. She gently closed her small fingers around the cross. "And every time you wear it, I want you to remember, no matter what, you're never alone." Her fingers tightened around the necklace, her eyes glistening with tears. A small sob escaped her little throat before she rushed toward Karoline, wrapping her arms tightly around her. Karoline held her close, feeling the small body tremble against her chest. Somewhere behind her, the chatter of the crowd seemed to die down. No one spoke, but the atmosphere was suddenly heavy, not with sadness, but with something deeper, quieter, something that needed no words. The little girl held Karoline tightly, as if afraid that if she let go, the moment would disappear. The moment stretched as if time had stopped. Finally, she slowly let go, raising the back of her hand to wipe away the remaining tears on her cheeks. But even as she did so, her little fingers still clutched the necklace, as if afraid that if she let go, it would disappear. Karoline looked at her, seeing the emotions that sparkled in her eyes. Gratitude, wonder, and something deeper, hard to name. A knowing beyond her years. From the crowd, a woman stepped forward, her hands shaking slightly. Karoline didn't need to ask. She knew. This was the girl's mother. I don't know what to say, the woman whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The woman's eyes, tired but gentle, moved from Karoline to her daughter. She talks about that necklace every night, the one I had to sell. Her voice caught. I never thought she'd have another one. Karoline smiled slightly. Now she does. The woman swallowed, her lips trembling as she let out a long breath, trying to regain her composure. Thank you, she whispered. This means more than you can imagine. But Karoline understood. She knew exactly what it meant, because once upon a time, she had been on the other side, the one who had taken a small but hopeful thing, when hope was the hardest thing to hold on to. The silence that had lingered in the room finally broke, like a gentle breeze. People began to move, some quietly wiping away tears, a few exchanging meaningful glances. A few of the older women put their hands to their chests, nodding, as if they had just witnessed something profound that they could not put into words. Then something unexpected happened. From the back of the room, a man stepped forward. He was tall, with a sturdy build, his clothes somewhat shabby, his hands rough, the marks of a life of hard labor. Without saying anything, he reached into his pocket, withdrew a small wad of money, and gently placed it in the mother's hand. For food, he said simply. No explanation was needed. No name was needed. Just a silent, yet powerful gesture. The mother took a sharp breath, shaking her head vigorously. Oh, I can't take this. Please, the man interrupted, his voice low but firm. It's not charity. It's the right thing to do. And just like that, something clicked. Another man stepped forward, offering a gift card to the local grocery store. A woman took a small bracelet from her wrist and gently placed it on the girl's hand. To go with your necklace, she whispered. Bit by bit, kindness spread throughout the room. No one said it out loud, but each person found a way to give. Even if it was just a small item, a simple gesture. These things individually might not seem like much, but together those small acts became something powerful. Karoline took a step back, watching as strangers became more than anonymous faces in a crowd. This was never about her, and in fact, it never was. It was about something bigger, something that started with a simple question from a little girl. Because sometimes faith is more than just believing, sometimes it's about doing. Moments that really matter don't just happen and then disappear. They left a mark, an echo that lingered long after the dust had settled. As the crowd dispersed, Karoline stood there feeling the silence. Not empty, not cold, but full of something intangible. Something that lingered long after the moment had passed. Karoline stood still for a moment, watching the little girl clutch the necklace to her chest like a treasure. The mother squeezed her daughter's hand, her eyes still glistening with unshed tears, whispering something, words only the two of them could understand. A simple, small moment amid the murmur of conversation around them, almost unnoticed. But Karoline knew. This moment would stay with them forever. And if she was honest with herself, it would stay with her too. When she walked into the community center, she hadn't expected much. Just a few handshakes, some small talk, maybe a polite round of applause. But she left with more. Something deeper, something more real, something she couldn't have predicted but would carry with her forever. Instead, she'd been given a reminder of something she'd learned long ago. The smallest moments often mean the most. The little girl probably didn't realize it, but she'd also given Karoline a gift, something deeper than the necklace. She'd reminded her why faith mattered, why kindness, especially kindness without expectation of return, was always worth it. For a time, Caroline had thought faith meant having all the answers. That night in her grandmother's bedroom, she'd prayed for a sign, just one, a clear, undeniable signal. But then, as she grew older, Caroline realized something. Faith wasn't about knowing everything. It was about believing. Believing that even in the most difficult moments, even when there were no clear answers, there was always light somewhere. And sometimes that light came from a small hand gently tugging at your sleeve. She exhaled, feeling a quiet warmth creep into her chest, as if something had found its place inside her. Caroline turned to leave, but before she could lift her foot, she felt a gentle tug on her sleeve. The little girl was looking up at her again, her fingers still clutching the cross. "Auntie Caroline," she called softly. Caroline leaned down again, her eyes soft. "What is it, honey?" She hesitated, then said softly, "I think Mom is right. You gave me more than a necklace." Caroline smiled, her eyes shining. "And I gave you more than a question?" The little girl smiled brightly, then turned and ran back to her mother, still clutching her new gift. Caroline watched them leave, feeling lighter than she ever thought possible. She didn't know what the road ahead would hold for that little girl, for that mother. She couldn't promise that life would always be easy, but one thing she knew for sure, one thing they could all do, was make sure no one had to walk alone. So next time you have the chance to offer a little kindness, do it. You never know whose heart needs it the most. And if this story has touched you in any way, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Spread the word. Be someone's light in their darkest moments. If you want to hear more stories that matter, don't forget to subscribe, because the best stories are the ones that remind us of who we really are.